Hey, good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be here again on another Sabbath. Today is June the 13th, and we enter into lesson 10 of our Bible class 2020. Obviously, this will be 2020 to 2021 if we go all the way to Revelation 22. And I suspect we have a long way ahead of us, but we've done this before. Those of you who were with us 2018 to 2019, you know we have been through this before. But I think this time around we're adding some stuff that we didn't have before. So I'm hoping that those of you who were part of the program before, you are really having another chance to review stuff that we covered before and really see the blessings of God as we go forward this time around. Thank you all for joining. We have a good bit of people on Zoom, at least 15 or so people on Zoom, and we have another 20 on YouTube. And for the first time today, we are actually streaming live on Facebook as well, using a Cochrane SDA Facebook page. So there are some folks on that as well, and we welcome them. Somebody will have to monitor that just to see if there are any questions coming from that medium. But we'll continue to monitor, certainly through my interaction here, the questions that come via Zoom and those that come via YouTube. So thank you all for coming. We have a lot to cover today, so I thought we should just get straight into it, right? So let's just bow our heads a prayer. Father, we thank you for your blessings. We thank you for this message you have given to us through your word and through the prophecies of Daniel and later Revelation. Lord, we believe that even way back then, you were concerned about Earth's history. You were concerned about giving us some insight into the troubles and the circumstances that will affect our lives. But we can live with the assurance, that indeed you are still in control. We thank you for being our God who stays in control and our God who keeps us. These are the mercies we ask in Jesus' most holy name. Amen. All right, so let's get going. We want to get right into today's session. And so we will think that the share, that's a share. Sorry, I have to hit share. Yeah, so let's get going. We have a lot of slides to cover today, but I will move at a pretty even clip because I know a lot of you have been here before and some of you will be picking up what we covered a few weeks ago. So today's session is entitled 4 Kings. I deliberately said including a little horn. I know whenever this topic is presented, there is a temptation to say 4 kingdoms and a little horn. And I thought it's important to drive home a very important point to suggest to you that the little horn we'll encounter today in Daniel. And if you haven't heard about the little horn, just keep with us today because we have a lot to cover. But the little horn we will cover today in Daniel, it is part of the 4th kingdom. And if you remember what we studied last week when we looked at Rome and the history of the church, you would recall that Rome virtually went through periods of metamorphosis. It's almost as if it transformed itself from being a total civil power to being a civil stroke religious power. You saw a sort of marrying of church and state. And then it later on, when the civil or political Rome was destroyed and totally overrun by whether it was the Muslims or whether it was the barbarians in the west or the Muslims in the east, the church still continued as the head, as a Roman nation, if you will, and perpetrated, propagated, if you will, a lot of the Roman culture and the Roman way of life throughout the regions. And so it is useful to recognize, and I think all the historians, that Gibbons and others, recognize that the Roman nation, if you will, went through a metamorphosis. And it continued, if you will, through the Roman church. And if you accept that premise, then it's realistic to assume that the Roman church, which still exists today, in the form of the Roman Catholic Church, which is now the historical descendant, if you will, of what was the early Christian church, the only Christian church at the time, even though there were opposers to the Christian church who would have then been living in the rocks and the mountains and hiding in dungeons. So in a way, you could argue there were two Christian churches, a church that had become polluted, corrupted, if you will, by syncretism, which we talked about last week, and a true church of believers who lived in the shadows, if you will, but nonetheless would have preserved the beliefs of the apostles. And then when Martin Luther came in around the 1598, you found that, or whenever it was 15, you found that there was a fertile ground for Martin Luther's Protestant belief because of this second church, if you will, that was operating in solidarity and against the church. All right, so let me just summarize that again. I'm saying to you that what we studied last week was that we saw that the Roman Empire was a huge empire and that it covered both East and Western Europe. And that a lot of times when we discuss Rome, we think about Western Europe, but Eastern Europe, Constantinople, Old Turkey, Istanbul were critical parts of the Roman Empire, and that Western Europe first collapsed as a civil power and was replaced by a religious power, and then that religious power coexisted with the civil power that existed in the East for a while, and then later on, as the East itself crumbled, the religious power adopted to a large extent powers of political and civil authority in addition to its religious authority, and predominated. And during that period, those who were opposed to the church found themselves persecuted, put to death, operating in dungeons and tunnels and areas where they had to hide to serve their God as they saw it, as the truth, if you will. And the religious power that was now united with political power persecuted those Puritans and those Christians who had remained pure to what they believed the apostles wanted them to believe. And that is extremely, extremely important to understand that differentiation. And if you didn't understand it when I said it a while ago, don't worry, we will be covering it again in the class today. All right, so that's just some background as to why our topic today says including a little more. Let's go on. We continue to talk about a review of some key points. We again remind all of us that we are, of course, focused on the Macedonian area, which is really where the Fertile Crescent existed, which is more east of the European, of the Mediterranean, if you will, the Mediterranean basin. So this is fundamentally where the theater of operation with respect to Daniel takes place, and we understand that. And we talk about Mesopotamia. And then we talked a little bit about the fact that the Jews operating more towards the east, the west, as you can see, close to the Mediterranean Sea. The Jews would have been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, and they would have found themselves, if you will, taken from their home and traversing this long distance, which would have been a long, long travel, many, many, many months, I would suggest almost years, to get to Babylon because they're moving by foot. And then they would have had to return home to their land after 70 years in exile in the Babylonian kingdom. So this is kind of what we have been studying. We then discussed, again, these are just review points, but it's now getting you back into the Daniel spirit after we've had 3 weeks of interlude and preparation for where we are today. We then discussed that there are 2 forms of prophecy that seem to proliferate the Old Testament and to some extent the New Testament as well. And some of it we have again used the terminology of one of the ancient writers, one of the scholars within the church who has classified the writings into 2 categories. One is called classical prophecy, and these are prophecies that were fulfilled in very, very real ways and very immediate ways, but were also conditional. And I always remind you of prophecy of Jonah to the city of Nineveh, where he said to them, God is going to destroy you unless you repent. And the people repented, and God refused to destroy them because he kept his word. I like to know that I serve a God who keeps his word. And when the people were not destroyed, Jonah was a little bit upset because he felt he looked as a discredited prophet. But God said, no, that was my intent. If I said to them, if they repent, they'll be okay, then they repented, and therefore you should be willing to recognize that they repented, and therefore they do not deserve destruction anymore. On the other side, we have the apocalyptic prophecies, which are the prophecies primarily in Daniel and Revelation. These give a wide sweep of Earth's history and talk about things that will take place over a long period of time. And they display God's plan for the nations. And really, the fulfillment of these prophecies are, to a large extent, irrespective of whether or not people had certain attitudes or made decisions along the way. This was a wide sweep of history. And it is in this era, this area of apocalyptic prophecies that we are really delving to when we move into Daniel chapter 7, which is our focus for today. We reminded that when we looked at one of the interludes, we were told, and we spent some time discovering. I don't like to use the word told because I'm hoping that I am not being dogmatic and you are actually discovering as much as I am discovering along the way. So we discovered, if you will, that there's a certain unity in the Bible, and that both the Old Testament and the New Testament pointed, in my picture on the right, pointed to Jesus Christ. And we really saw that come alive to us when we looked at the sanctuary service. I mean, that was a classical expectation typology, to use a word that some of you would have studied this week. It was a classical typology where we found that the type of service that was enacted in the wilderness and later on in Solomon's temple really pointed to the ultimate true sacrifice, which is Jesus Christ. And then as in the New Testament, we find that all the apostles and the writings of a lot of the apostles are looking back, if you will, to the fact that Jesus has died. You and I do that today. We fall on our knees and we ask God to forgive us of our sins on the premise that Jesus already died. So we are looking back each time, while the ancient patriarchs and the Old Testament believers would have been offering sacrifices looking towards Jesus' sacrifice. You and I today look back to Jesus' sacrifice. And it's in that context that we are very clear that the Old and the New Testament both point to Jesus Christ. We then said that there were, and you, if you've been in this class long enough, I know some of you studied something else this week, but nonetheless, or something close to this, I want to be very clear that we expect and we work on the premise that there are basically 4 buckets of biblical interpretation that people have used over the years: pretheism, idealism, which was, I think, not picked up this week, but nonetheless, we want to keep it there, historism, and futurism, right? And we went through that before, but this is just a quick review. And so I build on what was presented during our lesson study this week. So Isaiah the prophet, we are told in the New International Version, I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times, what is to come. I say my purpose will stand, and I will do all that I please. So God is really trying to explain to us what is taking place. And over the years, I would argue that historism was the default approach towards studying the Bible. But as some very well know, and we studied this week actually, when we had a very interesting presentation on the Point Fountain Zoom presentation this week, that during the counter-revolution, some of the Jesuit priests would have pushed pretheism and some even pushed futurism as an alternative to the historicist approach to studying of the prophecies. Forget all of that jargon. Let's just get on to brass tacks. When we talk about pretheism, we assume that all the events spoken of in the prophecies have already taken place, and therefore what is in the prophecies is not really important for us today. There's more of a historical context and where people kind of go through that just to understand the flow of history. By the way, there is a lot of conversation taking place within our country, of all places, this week around historical antecedents. And some people are now making strong representation to take down the statue of Christopher Columbus in Port of Spain because of what he represents in the context of Black Lives Matter. So again, that is just giving you a sense that even though the events occurred in the past, they still have impact upon us today. So pretheism, I diverted, but pretheism is really an expectation, if you will, that everything has already happened in the past. Futurism is quite the opposite. It assumes that all of that is going to take place in the future, and therefore there is no need to worry except you're going to live long and you're going to be around that time. The problem is you don't know when the future will start in the context of these prophecies, but it is also another way of de-escalating what the prophecies mean and suggesting that if you think about it all in the future, then you should have to worry. But what we have held as our basis of this study is historism. And we are not doing this arbitrarily. When we read Daniel chapter 2, for instance, where God interpreted the prophecy for Daniel, God himself followed a historicist approach. In other words, he says, Daniel, when he talked to Nebuchadnezzar, he says, you are the head of gold, the present, but after you will come other kingdoms, and then they will go all the way to a period of feet of iron and clay, and then a stone will be cut out of nowhere, and the kingdom will last forever. So it was a prophecy that moved from the time of the prophet to the end of time. All right? And similarly, when we get into Revelation, you would find that a lot of the prophecies that John experiences are prophecies that occurred from the time of the first century when John existed, if you will, the first century AD, all the way to the end of time. So historicism is more natural. It kind of says the prophecy begins in the present in which it was given, but it has a long sweep, if you will, that carries it all the way to the very end of time. And I think that is if you read people like Isaac Newton, I always like to refer to these neutral kind of guys who were scientists but biblical scholars anyway. They too adopted a historicist approach when they gave their various commentaries and interpretation on the Bible going forward, right? So really the comment at the bottom of the slide is summarizes what we just said, which is to suggest that the sweep of history is what is covered by these prophecies. I wanted to keep idealism in our focus because when you talk to people who are very strong proponents of what is referred to as the New Age movement today, you get some of that creeping in. They kind of give you the view that the Bible is really an allegory and it's all allegorical and it's not really real and it's all just telling us there's good and bad in the world, but it doesn't really mean anything and it doesn't have any significance. So I wanted to keep that as our focus because that is also a thinking, if you will, and a prophetic interpretation that is still prominent in today's world, very much prominent in the modern world, and one that sometimes creates difficulties for us. Because when you deal with people who are leaning towards atheism, they tend to tell you that what is in the Bible is all an allegory, it's all a fable and a story about good versus evil, and therefore you shouldn't worry about that, right? But we again tell you that historism takes us through from the time in which the prophecy was given and kind of carries us all the way through to the very end. It unrolls and unravels as time goes on, all right? So that's another important point, this unraveling of history. I know that there is a kind of romanticism around prophetic writings, and people like to read the prophecies because they want to be able to see the future. But I want you to appreciate that what we are studying in this class and in other writings around the prophecy are really, because of where we sit in Earth's history, 2020 and in the 21st century and in the 22nd century. A lot of what we are studying has already happened. Yes, there are things to come, but a lot has already happened. So you find that as history unfolds, you are better able to identify what God was saying by looking back as opposed to looking forward. Now, I say that because I think there's always going to be a word of caution when you study Bible prophecy. If you someone read Bible prophecy to be some kind of smart man or somebody who has great ranks when you lie with your friends because you can tell the future, that's not what Bible prophecy is about. Bible prophecy is about assessing, if you will, the events of history and seeing that they lined up, if you will, with the prophetic writings of the scriptures and having greater confidence that God has a plan for this world and that God will see us through to the very end. And it therefore means that we need to order our lives in appropriate ways so that we can be ready for when Christ comes. Now, I say that because I don't want us to get into trying to find the optimum time to serve God. Some people say, well, if I know that these things will happen in a few years, I'll wait until that time to come to God. The fact is, life is uncertain. We can die any moment. And again, this is not in this study, but if you study life and death carefully in the Bible, you realize that when you die, the state in which you die is the end for you. There's no opportunity to change your character after you die. When you face the judgment on the basis of who you are when you are dead. So it's important, I think, to understand that what the studies of the prophecy does is that it reinforces that God is in control, and it gives us a greater impetus to remain faithful to God, to stay always under His guidance, and to allow Him to lead our lives day after day. Just a quick, again, part of the revision. One of the things we learned is that Daniel, for instance, will use the Bible to help him interpret the scriptures, so that it is important not to try to interpret the Bible in isolation, but to always interpret it in the context of the writings of the Bible itself. This becomes extremely important when we start to study Revelation. There are a lot of myths about Revelation. A lot of people have different views. But if you kept the writings of the Old Testament very clear in your head, when you read Revelation, then it becomes very, very simple, because Revelation uses a lot of Old Testament imagery and Old Testament anecdotes, if you will, to leverage and to present the prophecies in Revelation. And so you see things about Lamb, and you see stuff about Babylon, which is something we've already studied in the Old Testament. And if you begin to appreciate that, then you begin to appreciate that we should interpret the Bible. This is what this last section here says, by comparing verses, always in their context, and studying how the whole scripture deals with the topic at hand. So I really want to emphasize this part of our biblical prophecy to suggest that we use the Bible to give us context. And so when we talk about a yearly principle, for instance, we use what happened in a previous section of the Bible to give us interpretation around that. When we talk about winds and strife representing war and fighting and stuff, again, we use previous representations to do that. So at the end of the day, I'm saying to you that the Bible gives us enough material to be able to interpret in very general ways what is taking place. And then we have, of course, the supplemental writings of those who are prophetic, in our case, with respect to Ellen White, and those who would have studied as scholars and historians and would have given us a lot of things to go forward. So while the Bible is indeed our basis for interpretation, I thought I would just interject this here very quickly, because we'll have to come back to this later on, that in the book of Acts, Luke, who we believe is the one who would have written the book of Acts, he noted some of the advice coming from the early apostles that says, take heed of yourself and all the flock. In other words, he was talking to the apostles, among which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to shepherd the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. For I know this. Jesus is saying, right, this is a quote from Jesus, that after my departure, savage wolves will come among you, not sparing the flock. And from among yourselves, men will rise up speaking perverse things to draw away the disciples after themselves. This was a warning, if you will, a word of caution from Christ himself, where he spoke to his disciples. And he said to them that after he is gone, meaning obviously in the first century and the first century's church, doctrines will arise, if you will, that will try to push people. That is what he means by wolves. It doesn't mean that they will come as literal wolves, but they are coming by wolves in the sense of they will attempt to destroy and take away the pillars of what the church believes. And that is just something to note that I wanted to kind of leave within your presence. Any questions, anybody? We okay so far? Think we're doing all right? All right, let's keep going. We have a lot to cover. If you have a question, you can use the Q&A in Zoom, as well as your comments in YouTube. And if you have on Facebook, you can do that, and someone will raise it with us here within the teams. The other thing I wanted to just remind you is that, as a general rule, when we are interpreting prophecy, we know, and this is your homework, so I won't pull up these texts today, but Revelation 17:15 gives us a clear understanding that where we see seas, we should see that as symbolic of a place with plenty people. Then the way Jeremiah 49:36 and 37 was written, when we see wind and strife, we should interpret that as meaning war. And then when we see beasts, which we are going to study today, we will interpret that as kingdoms. All right? So again, this is just another key that you can keep with you, because this is kind of important in terms of how we will interpret some of these scriptures going forward. It's not going to be too applicable to today, but I just wanted to keep that with you. At least the last two will be applicable today, and the other one, we will come back to that when we get later down into detailed Daniel and then later into Revelation. The other thing is this thing about the year-day principle. So in some biblical prophecies, we will find that a span of time is covered, but it's covered in days. And really what is clear is that the historical context and what is presented in the prophecy cannot align to literal days, because so much is happening in that space that it seems to be a longer period than how many days is accounted for there. Now, you will understand that better when we get into the specific text. But I want you to appreciate where that came from. You all know, all of us grew up as the children knowing, that the children of Israel, or the Israelites, wandered in the wilderness of Sin, which is in the Arabian Peninsula on the map. They wandered there for 40 years. Where did that 40 years come from? Well, Numbers 14:34 tells us, and reminds us, if you will, that when they were about to enter Canaan, Joshua was, Moses had sent out these spies to survey the land, and they had spent 40 days surveying the land. And when they came back and they said, well, the land is good and ready to go and stuff, the people were worried and they were afraid, they didn't want to go, and they basically frowned upon the direction in which God was pushing them. And because of their rebellion, God said, look, you're not ready to go into the wilderness, and into Canaan, sorry, and therefore you will wander in the wilderness for a year for every day that these guys were outside. And they were outside for 40 days. So for every day, they were given a year to wander. And so they wandered for 40 years. Similarly, in Ezekiel, again, that reference comes back to the prophet Ezekiel in the new incarnation, where the Jews are back into trying to get Canaan going again. And God gives him a very famous statement. He says, lie down on your right-hand side, and you shall see that I will give you every day for a year. So that, again, he was making reference to the same 40 days within the wilderness. So I'm saying to you that, again, this whole question of the Bible building upon what came before. So that when we encounter certain days of prophecy, in Daniel chapter 8 and 9 in particular that we are coming to, and a little bit in chapter 7. When we encounter those days, and I tell you, as I will, that the only way that makes sense if to interpret the prophecy is to treat those days as representing years. Two things are happening. One is that I'm able to solve the riddle of the prophecy, because if I use years, then again, given where we stand in today's world, we can look back and see that if we use years, it actually worked out according to what the prophecy said. And the other is that I'm building on what was a precedent set by God himself when he talked about the 40 days in the wilderness. And that is, to me, Loctite, because it kind of says that I'm not arbitrarily saying 40 days is equal to 40 years. I'm building on what the Bible did, and this yearly principle is applicable. However, it is not a carte blanche kind of thing. You can't just, it's not a key. Every time you see days in the Bible, say that means years. There's some things I must follow, right? So the first thing is that a prophetic period mentioned in a passage with symbolic must be mentioned in a passage that also includes symbolic elements. So if there are other symbols being represented in the passage, then certainly we are in a good place to infer that where we see days, it is quite likely that this doesn't mean literal days, but it means that it could mean years, right? And the yearly principle applies. The events, and this is the one I talked about a while ago, the events must fit the timeline. So if we say that it represents days, and the days represents years, then if the events inside there line up, then we are okay. And then there's another one which we'll encounter when we talk about this next week, which is the other half of Daniel chapter 7. They are not mentioned in the usual way. So sometimes you find the Bible may say half a time, evening and mornings, months of 30 days. So when it uses things like that, don't be confused. I'm just saying that there's a context in which we use the prophetic and the principle. So just going back quickly, in the Bible we have some representations when we do prophecy. But when we see seas used in the prophecy, there is a strong indication that seas represents people. When we see wind, it represents war and strife. When we see beasts, which we study today, represents kingdoms. And then sometimes it is very applicable to use days for years in looking at the time periods within the prophecies. So let's keep moving. Any questions? Anybody? Everybody okay? You all feeling all right? Decided to breathe a little bit because we move at our pace today, but I think we have a lot to get through and we will. So let's keep going, right? Let's go back to what we discovered about the book of Daniel, which is by now you all are very good students of this. The first thing we know is that the book is written in Aramaic and Hebrew. And the Aramaic sections are what we have been covering so far. And this Daniel chapter 7 is the last of the Aramaic sections, which was the popular writings at the time. And we had looked at the vision of the empires, God delivers on the fiery furnace, and then Nebuchadnezzar is judged. And we said there's a kind of mirror image taking place in literature. And if you flipped around the mirror and you did some lateral inversion, you'd find that when Belshazzar is judged, it's almost the same as if when it's a mirror of when Nebuchadnezzar was judged. God delivers on the land, and it's like when he delivered from the fiery furnace. And what we'll study today is our return to the vision of empires, right? And then we discussed the fact that there are narratives and prophetic sections in the book, right? Apocalyptic sections. So some narrative stories which we've kind of covered, chapters 1 to 6, and now we're ready to eat big food. So we move it into the prophetic section. You have had your palates wet and you're ready for the deep stuff. So we're getting into that today, right? Some quick reviews. I told you that Babylon practiced capture and convert. We know that well, that was kind of their main message, that when Babylon held you, they would capture and convert. And then we also learned in Daniel chapter 2, when we saw the vision of the image, which was a vision that Nebuchadnezzar got, but God gave the interpretation to Daniel, who then told it over to the king. All right, and we said that The head of gold represented Babylon. We said that the succession of metals and the image of the man is consistent with the succession of kingdoms that occurred in that same Mesopotamian area, and how they would have affected God's people. But this is more what, and I want to come back to this in a bit. And let me just say to you that what Daniel chapter 2 gave us was the political landscape. What Daniel chapter 7 will give us is not just the political landscape, but how the political landscape affected God's people. In Daniel chapter 2, we get a broad outline of how the thing would move. In Daniel chapter 7, we get another outline, but we are told in more specific terms how it will affect God's people, right? And that is extremely important. So we saw a parade, if you will, and by the way, we are fortunate enough to say very convincingly that indeed these kingdoms did happen. It is a historical fact that Babylon existed for a while. It was succeeded by the Medes and the Persians with champions such as Cyrus and Darius the Mede, a partnership kingdom. And then we know that the Greeks ran the world for a while, or that area of the world for a while. And then the Romans came. The Romans were really different. And the fact that they are represented by iron is also kind of ironic, because the Romans were one of those who mastered the use of iron. The Romans had iron chariots and iron spears. They had buildings where they were able to dig out iron ore and use it in blacksmith shops and make very good shoes for their horses and that kind of stuff. So the Romans, even without a biblical reference, are referred to as the people who mastered iron. And strange enough, well, I don't think it's strange. I think it's just God's doing. He represents them as the legs of iron. And then we are told that Rome continues into today, but in a very limited sense in terms of its influence. But we have the feet of iron and clay. That is the summary of chapter 2. And then we are told that really this was a prelude to the fact that one day a large kingdom will be established that will last forever, and that kingdom belongs to God. But it will come in the feet of iron and clay, which is exactly the time in which we live in today. All right? In chapter 3, we experienced, I had then dropped the word for you all revisionists. I told you that Nebuchadnezzar revised the history or the prophecy as he got it, and he created one image made completely of gold. You know that by now I am not necessarily a convert in believing it was the image of a man. It simply said an image of 60 cubits and 6 cubits wide, etc. But it was the fact that it was made up of 6, which was the sexagesimal system that the Babylons used, meaning that he was building according to what he believed to be the true thing, as opposed to what God gave him. All right, and he forced the guys to worship, but they were saved, if you will, from the fiery furnace. We then had in Daniel chapter 4 where the king became a little bit too proud, and because of his pride, he was cut down for about 7 years. He lived as a madman, and then he came back up and joined, right? And then I told you that we needed to bridge the narrative section with the prophetic section, and we spent some time over the last 3 weeks looking at the Bible, the cosmic conflict. We looked at the sanctuary services, and then we looked at the history of the early church, right? So those things, they have given us that bridge that you see there. That is what we're building. I know it doesn't look like a bridge on the highway to Point, but it is a bridge. It looks like a bridge that we're building that is going to get us to where we are heading today, right? So I'm ready to hit Daniel chapter 7. Any questions? We have some time, we can finish it. Any questions? Anybody from what we reviewed so far have any concerns? Anyone has any concerns? So far, so good. You know, that was some of the old Magnificent Seven, right, when they were waiting to be shot. Said, how are things going? He said, so far, so good. So we're going, right? All right, let's keep going. Right, no questions. Let's keep going. So in Daniel chapter 7, now that we have covered all that ground, I want to move a little bit slower. This is another prophetic vision from God. Notice, and by the way, I have not devoted a lot of time to reading the passages together as a group. Maybe that's something we can do in the future. But I'm assuming that you have read Daniel chapter 7 before you come into this class, right? That's a minimum homework to come in here. Because it's kind of important to understand that, right? So it starts off by saying, I think it was the second year of Belshazzar. So this is another prophetic vision from God. Daniel gets the vision himself directly. So it didn't come to Nebuchadnezzar, it didn't come to wise men or nothing. It came straight to Daniel. It comes around 553 BC. So it is 50 years after the vision of Daniel chapter 2. Notice that Daniel is still in play because he was captured as a young man, and some have estimated he was well about 70 years by this time. But he's still very active and he's still working hard. He hasn't resigned and given up his role and stuff as an elder. He's still a senior member of the church and he's active, right? So it's about 70 years. Nebuchadnezzar has been dead, according to the timing of this, by about 9 years now. So he's really moving into the era where he is seeing Belshazzar coming in. A matter of fact, it actually says it was in the second year of Belshazzar's reign. So Belshazzar is already in the chair. And you by now, you are great students in the Bible. You know that Belshazzar was the last Babylonian king who was put to death during the invasion in Daniel chapter 5. Daniel 5 and 6 are still in the future. So there's another point to note that the passages are not given in chronological order in the Bible itself, right? In the first year. Thank you for that. You brought it back to my memory. So it was given in the first year of the vision of Belshazzar. So I got some support for that, and I'm happy for that. That's why I like this class. So it was in the first year of the king Belshazzar. So clearly Belshazzar is now on the throne. Daniel is still concerned about what happens to his people because he knows that the prophet Jeremiah gave a classical prophecy that said they will spend 70 years in Babylonian captivity. So he wants to go back home, and that is preoccupying his mind. He wants to get to his version of heaven in those days, which is back to Canaan. So it is in that period where he, as a remnant under control of Babylon, he is praying and asking, and God visits him with a prophecy. And I really like that imagery, because I like to think that we are last-day Christians heading to our heavenly home, and sometimes we may be under oppression and persecution, but God is still with us. And you can say even where you are, right? So I'm saying to you that chapters 5 and 6 have not yet happened, because Belshazzar's demise has not yet happened, and Darius the Mede, which was the king, was when he was on the lion's den. That has not yet happened as well, right? So let's keep going. So I want you to keep some key things in your head as we go through, right? Daniel is the last chapter in Aramaic, and it is a very much a parallel chapter to Daniel chapter 2. I say that to say that it is foolish to interpret Daniel chapter 7 in any different sequence to what we have studied in Daniel chapter 2. If you are arriving at a conclusion that puts the sequence of kingdoms in Daniel chapter 7 different from the sequence in chapter 2, then something is wrong. So again, that is just another key to interpretation, and you need to remember that, right? So he's again shown the empires of the world, and he's shown them from the ones that occur in his time all the way to the end. And I want to say to you that that is historicism at its best. And then that last bullet is the one that I really want you to pay attention to. And I'll come back to that in a little bit to say to you that while chapter 2 gave a political sweep of the kingdoms of the world, in Daniel chapter 7, he's moved beyond metals and he starts to talk about the characteristics of the kingdom, because to a large extent, their characteristics would have influenced how they treated God's people and so the kind of domination that they showed with God's people. Is that okay? But you all right with that? Good, let's keep going. So there are 4 major themes, if you will, or is it 5? I can't remember. 4 or 5. We'll come to that I want to cover in this chapter. So the 4 beasts are covered in Daniel chapter 7, verses 1. I like to say 1 to 8. Yeah? And then what we are very fortunate about the book of Daniel is that we really don't have to guess too much interpretation, because in verses 15 to 17, the angel in Daniel's vision comes back and gives him guidance as to what the images and the animals he saw means. So that's extremely important, right? Then we will encounter a little horn that is mentioned there, that is in Daniel chapter 7, verse 8. And again, that's why I say I rather talk about the 4 beasts and go all the way to 8. But anyway, the little horn is in Daniel chapter 8. And then 19 to 25. It talks a little about that, and we'll come back and talk about that. Interestingly, a judgment scene appears within this chapter. It's almost as if it's a parenthetical kind of scene, it's a vignette. Sometimes when those of us who have studied at universities and colleges and stuff, you have these textbooks and they continue to give you all the various things, and then they have a little cutout or a little section that are called vignettes, a little story that is placed in the chapter. It may be in a different color and a different bold type, just to give you a story that emphasizes something around the chapter. This judgment scene that occurs in this story of 4 beasts and a little horn is a similar vein. It's like a vignette. It's a story that is inserted, if you will, into the flow of the prophecy. And that I find very interesting. And it certainly arouses my curiosity, and I want to find out why that happened. Within the vignette, there's a reference to the Son of Man and a role that he plays in the judgment, and we want to talk about that. But it ends on a good note, irrespective of how it got here, by saying that the saints of the Most High, and that language, saints kind of suggests people who are not necessarily perfect, but people who have accepted God. I want to be very, very clear about that. We are not perfect beings, but we all, once we are covered by Christ. Jesus uses that term. If you go back and read Jesus's prayer for his disciples before he went to be crucified, in John chapter 17, he referred to them as saints. There's also references in Psalms where he refers to the people as saints. These are not perfect people. They're imperfect people, but they are saints by the fact that they have given their lives to Christ. God is willing to call us saints one way or the other, right? So the saints of the Most High, they remain, they experience victory. And so therefore, these are the 5 main sections of the book. What I would like to do today is cover the first 2. And then we will come back and talk a little bit about judgment. And then we will talk a little bit about saints, right? So I see us maybe spending 3 sessions, if you will, covering Daniel chapter 7, because we are now into the meat of the matter. So let's do what we know so far. So Daniel says, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven was stirring up the great sea. So if you have remembered my slide from before, you know that sea from Revelation 17 is representative or symbolic of a place with people. And then from Jeremiah 49, you know that stirring up and winds really represents strife. So God is saying to Daniel that amongst the people of the world, and a bit is strife, because remember that these kingdoms, I mean, we like to nicely point to these kingdoms that came out of Daniel chapter 2 and said, well, after Babylon came Media Persia, and some of you know it by rote. And after Media Persia, there was Greece, and after Greece, there was Rome. I want you to know that these were not passive transitions. These were not transitions that were occurring and where Babylon comes and says, hey, your turn, take the relay battle and you run out. No, no, no. These were battles. These were world wars. These were places where a lot of drama was taking place and people were fighting, etc. So that is where we get this concept of strife coming from. So he says, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven was striving up the great sea. So great sea, again, if we use the terminology we found in Revelation, he's trying to say, I mean, this is not a big point, but it's helpful as you begin to appreciate the prophecies. He's saying that the great sea represents people, and therefore if there's strife and war among the people, out of that, beasts are coming up from the sea, each different from the other, right? So that is what effectively Daniel would have seen. And I just want to make sure you understand. He's sleeping, he's getting a vision. He sees a lion with some wings on it. He sees a bear that is not shown enough here, but it's a lopsided bear. So, and it has 3 teeth in its mouth. He sees a leopard with 4 heads and wings again. And then he sees a 4th beast that has 10 horns on it, but it defies classification within the animal kingdom. So he doesn't know how to call it, he just simply calls it a beast. But when we get to verses 15 to 17, we know that the interpretation interprets these as kingdoms. So again, this is a good, I could give you a hint by now, that this is in parallel with chapter 2. So if we went from lion to bear to leopard to beast, then you could think gold, silver, brass, iron. Lion, bear, leopard, beast, gold, silver, brass, iron. If you say that a few times in your sleep and stuff and you begin to remember it plenty, this will become real easy for you. If in the Daniel chapter 2, the head of gold represented Babylon, then it is reasonable to conclude that a lion also represents Babylon, which is not a bad representation because the lion is the king of the beasts and gold was the most precious of metals. The bear represents Media Persia, and we said it is a lopsided bear, which kind of suggests a kind of 2-power sharing kind of thing, which is classical Media Persia, silver. And then brass, which is Greece. We now encounter 4 heads, which we will come back and figure out what that means. And then, so that is Greece. And then this must therefore be Rome. And we have to figure out why there are 10 horns and all that happens with this, right? So that is just a quick summary of where we are. If you understand that, we would have really made great insights in today's message. So again, just to dramatize it, if you will, these 4 beasts, this is what verse 17 said. It says, these great beasts, which are four kings which shall arise out of the earth. And again, when he uses the word kings, he really means kingdoms, right? So he uses kings and kingdoms simultaneously to represent the various settings with respect to kings and kingdoms. So one is the lion, of course, one is the bear with 3 holes out there, and the other is the beast. They don't, I mean, different authors have different ways of representing our 4 beasts. They look like all kind of different things, but at the end of the day, it's a dragon type. All right, so let's go quickly to what the Bible said. It says, it first was like a lion that had eagle's wings. I watched until its wings were plucked off. And it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given unto it. So very specific language being used here to represent this thing. And I want to give you quick representations of that because I know you are fair students of this and you understand. So the Babylonian Empire is, of course, represented by the lion. Its wings were plucked off. We know that. We knew that Babylon rose very, very quickly under Nebuchadnezzar. But after some time, certainly after Nebuchadnezzar's death, it didn't move as fast as Nebuchadnezzar did. So that's what is seen to be depicted here by saying that its wings were plucked off. It was lifted up from the earth, meaning it loses its dignity and declines. So in a way, that's kind of representation for that. It is no longer, if you put a lion in the earth, in the air, he really is out of his depth because his strength is in the earth. So it's not really the same kingdom as before. And then a man's heart was given unto it. A man's heart means that it is now, a lion by its very instinct and nature is a ferocious beast who is afraid of nobody. You could cock the gun, he will drive after you because the lion instinctively fears nobody. Man, on the other hand, we fear things because we are not driven by instinct. We're driven by history and knowledge and experience. And if we have a sense that a gun can kill us, then we become fearful, right? So when it says a man's heart was given to it, we can assume that it becomes fearful at some point in time. Let's allow me to switch my cameras a bit. I see one of my cameras is dying. Right. So, so a man's heart was given it and became fearful, right? So I think we begin to appreciate that this is clearly the Babylonian Empire. Any questions on this? I think that one is pretty clear. Everybody understands that. Our real focus is the fourth beast in this session today. So this is Babylon, and Babylon would have ruled from 605 to 539 BC, right? So this is a relatively short period of time, and they would have acquired a significant amount of land and stuff after that period. The next one, he says, and suddenly another beast, I'm quoting exactly the text, right? This is Daniel chapter 7, verse 5. And suddenly another beast is second, like a bear. It raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth, in the 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it said, thus arise, devour much flesh. So we know that the kingdom that came after Babylon was the Media-Persians, which was a partnership kingdom. So immediately I could kind of believe that the lopsidedness of the bear suggests that this was a double-barrel type kingdom. One side being higher than the next, meaning that one group was more powerful than the others. Again, what do we know? We know for sure that the Persians were clearly the stronger members of the partnership. And the Persians became, I mean, today people refer to that whole area as Persia. People, they even remember Medes and Midianites. But the Medes and the Persians were part of what came together. Let's talk about the 3 ribs. Now, when the Medes and the Persians came together, they would have had to conquer Babylon. So this is the Mediterranean Sea. Egypt is here. Lydia, which was then another name for Turkey that we have today, that would exist in the north, and then you have in the west here the kingdoms. And then in this area here that says Media Persia would have really been where Babylon existed. This Libya here is really just for reference, right? So don't get confused. The fact is, for Media Persia to become powerful, we learned in Daniel chapter 5 that Cyrus invaded Babylon and went under the city and controlled the city through the river Euphrates, which is in this area here. So clearly the Media-Persian Empire would have had to capture Babylon, and then what? Okay, so something pop up on my screen. Would have had to capture Babylon, and then they would have moved south and captured Egypt, and they would have moved a little bit north and captured Lydia. So Media-Persia began, if you will, by conquering this area east of the Mediterranean Sea, and then they moved their kingdom further east. And I always like to keep in your minds that when we study the book of Esther, we were told that the king's wife was called Vashti. So of course an East Indian name, and therefore should have come from India, because the Media-Persians, Ahasuerus and his men after Xerxes, would have extended the Persian Empire all the way to the east and covered as far as India. All right, but they actually began their conquest by first conquering Babylon, then they spread south and conquered Egypt, which was always a worrying nation because Egypt was an old kingdom and could always come back. And then because of the sea and the ability to access the sea, They wanted to control this area so they could have an outpost to exit if they needed to carry their stuff. And then they started to head more east. All right? So that is kind of what is represented here. The Medes and the Persians, they originated in conquering Babylon, and then they also captured the day of Egypt. Does that look like three bones, if you will? I think so, because it is saying that for the bear to survive or to live, he had to first eat up these three bones and then start to become big and powerful. And that's exactly what happened. So what you then found is that the bear, we're saying, represents the Medo-Persian Empire. I hope we all haven't been lost on this and drop asleep yet. And that it was raised on one side, of course, because the Persians were stronger than the Medes. It had three ribs in his mouth because they conquered Lydia, Babylon, and Egypt, as the three nations we talked about. And then it said, arise, devour much flesh. It conquered a large area with a lot more veracity. So the Medo-Persian Empire was a really powerful empire, and it spread far and wide. All right? So we had the Medo-Persians who would have gone until around 331 BC. All right? From 539 to about 331 BC. So remember, all this is before Christ, and this is a period in which they are at their full base. So we've covered two so far. Let's keep going. And I looked, and there was another which was like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings. Of a bird, the beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given unto it. So this one is easy, because we know that Greece came up after the Medo-Persians, and we know, those of you who remember what we've discovered so far, we talked about this a little bit. We know that the Greeks were governed by Alexander, who was referred to as Alexander the Great. There were movies and stuff around him. But Alexander was able to unite the Greek Empire and carried its dominance and its prominence, but he died at a very young age. They claim he had a cold or some flu or something. I don't know. So he died at around age 32 or something like that. And when he died, he really had no successor. And there was a lot of arguments around his generals as to who will control. And so Ptolemy and Seleucid and others, the 4 of them, they kind of came together as the more powerful of the generals. And they agreed, if you will, to divide the kingdom into 4, north, south, east, and west to some extent. And they are the ones who control the Greek Empire for most of its entirety. They and their descendants. After Alexander had died at an early age. So I would think, even without going to the next slide, I will give me the interpretation. I would think that the 4 heads represent the 4 generals of Alexander. I would think that the wings represents the speed at which the Greek Empire rose, because that in truth and in fact is the case. And I would think that this represents a leopard if only because it is not in the same category as Babylon and the Medo-Persia, just as how gold, silver, and brass represented the Greeks. He's a big kingdom and a powerful king, but not as powerful as the ones who went before him, right? So that is kind of what the representation is as we go forward. So that is clear. The leopard, we think, is the Greek Macedonian Empire out of Greek and Macedonia, etc. Had 4 wings, which kind of says it conquered quickly. It had 4 heads. There were 4 generals who divided up the kingdom, and it was given dominion, and they spread wider than previous empires. So in terms of covering area, I think I showed that sometime before. The Greece kingdom had really covered a long and flourishing area. All right? On to our next. So Greece would have gone until 168 BC. And if you were in class last week, you know that 168 is around the time that Julius Caesar was kind of taking his prominence and ruling the world. So after this, I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful, terrible, exceedingly strong, had a huge iron teeth. Iron. Once you see iron here, kind of tweak there, was devouring and breaking into pieces and trampling the residue with his feet. These are different description. This is a description that is a bit more ferocious, a little bit more vivid. It's almost as if the prophecy is suggesting that this is a different kind of beast, but a very ferocious beast in the way it was dealing with stuff, trampling on their feet. It was different. I don't need to tell you, the Bible says it, right? So Daniel 7:7 says, it was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. So let's go to that one quickly. One, we know that this must be the Roman Empire. It had huge iron teeth because they were known as the Iron Kingdom. I told you that before. And we saw it in Daniel chapter 2. It devours and breaks pieces and tramples. So they were very different in their strategies. The Romans would have covered different areas and conscript people, turn them into believers and disciples of them. They covered vast areas around the whole Mediterranean Sea, east and west. They used their naval fleet to help them in their conquering of nations, etc. So this was a really different kind of people, but they were very, very brutal. Let's not forget that. And it had 10 horns, and then this one says that the empire was divided into smaller parts, and we talk about that because last week we talked about 10 barbarian tribes that invaded Rome. All right, so we're saying that Rome went from, and I want you to pay attention to this if you can, please. I know these numbers always stick in your head, but let's pay attention to what is traditionally held as the end of Rome at 476 AD. And I want to suggest to you that that was not the end of Rome because it may have been the end of Western Rome, but from what we studied last week, Eastern Rome along the banks of Turkey, Constantinople was still flourishing, and that they, as they continued to flourish, but they couldn't manage the western side of Rome that was certainly being under drama here by the barbarian tribes in AD 476, which was a kind of cumulative year for when all the invasions and stuff would have taken place. They then said, look, we cannot manage this huge kingdom by being on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. So we will give the Bishop of Rome, who was the head of the church at the time, we'll give him some civil power, allow the Mediterranean stuff to follow him as emperor, and allow him to control and manage that area. That is what we saw in around AD 476. And then eventually, an emperor by the name of Justinian kind of cemented that officially in 538 AD. And we talk about that a little bit going forward. So just keep that in mind, please. Because you see, I want to say that because I want to let you know that in the 1500s, when Martin Luther was posting his 95 theses on the wall in the church in Germany, the Roman Empire was still in existence, albeit under the control of the Bishop of Rome. So to say that the Roman Empire ended in AD 476 is maybe not as accurate and precise as we like to be, because certainly the empire, this is my view, and it's clear by others, metamorphosis occurred, and it now transformed itself into a sort of pseudo-religious political power going forward. And that is what makes Rome very unique, because it is not like other kingdoms that continued along a royal line. Rome actually was able to inculcate strong Christian values, beliefs into its reign, and it emerged, if you will, as more of a religious political power than a political power that allowed religion to flourish. There's a huge distinction. This is saying that within the seat of power of the throne lied religious power as well. And that could have only happened when the Bishop of Rome, the head of the church then, the only Christian church, became a political leader as well as a spiritual leader, which is phenomenal if you think about it. So again, if you go back to the slide I had before, I want to remind you that this time we're looking at how the vision deals with God's people from a religious perspective, right? I want to put back up what we know of Rome just for your reckoning. This is what was old Babylon in this area here, because we're talking about the river Euphrates and Tigris. This is the Mediterranean Sea. So there's the eastern side, this is the western side. When we talk Rome, we like to talk only Western Rome. This is Italy here, of course, where Rome would have started as a colony and as a small kingdom. And still today, Rome exists in Italy. But, and this is Macedonia where the Greeks were, but the fact is, there's more to the mortar than the pestle. So we will go to that quickly. The fact is that we have Western Rome. If you were to draw an imaginary line just along the area of Turkey, etc., you would have had an imaginary line showing Western Rome, Eastern Rome, all right? And then what I said to you last week is that there were many tribes, if you will, existing in these areas here that were attempting to conquer Rome from time to time. And by 476, they had succeeded, but there was still Eastern Rome flourishing on the other side. So these were the 10 tribes. You don't need to remember the names. It's just to say that there were 10 tribes who lived in that western area around the time. And I can go to this slide that shows that they were predominantly within the western side of Rome, right? So Spain, Portugal, Germany, France, etc. All of these were predecessor tribes, if you will, that eventually gave birth to what is today known as modern-day Europe. All right, and that to me is extremely important. Again, I want to remind you that the vision of Daniel 7 involves God's people and their story from a religious perspective, right? So last week we looked at this slide and I told you that if you look at the timeline of the Christian church, it first started off as one Christian church. Whenever you wish to beat up the remaining Catholic Church, remember that all of us came from the one Christian church. But when this Christian church started to flourish in the New Testament after Christ, we found that there was some real heresies kind of creeping into the church. And so we had a group of people who remained faithful to God and kept, I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then as the church continued, we had it in the eastern side, we had a breaking away going to the Eastern Orthodox. And then on the western side, we had what is today known as the Roman Catholic Church, which is still the Church of Rome. All right, but the fact is that was a Christian church. Along the way, by 1517, which is the date I shall remember, Luther would have delivered almost 500 and something years ago. Luther delivers his thesis. And as a result of his thesis, the Protestant movement was started. And so a lot of the churches today who have names such as the Open Bible and the Adventists and the Baptists, etc., can claim their roots in Protestantism, which would have occurred out of Luther and his protests against the church. There are a lot of crusades going on here. And then the other thing I wanted to remind you is that during this period here of when Constantine came into power, and I'll talk about that, the church would have cemented a lot of beliefs and systems through a series of ecumenical councils, where they came together and re-established beliefs and traditions and stuff that they wanted us all to follow as a church. All right, so I think it's necessary just to quickly go back into our timeline of last week. If we were to look at last week's timeline, and those of you who missed this last week, it's on YouTube still, so you can look at that. We talk about the fact that there was a period, of course, before Christ, when you had Rome in its early stages and it's coming up, and then during Christ's time, Rome is running the world. You had Caesar Augustus ruling the world, and then Tiberius was the king thereafter. In this era, you had an emperor who began the Roman Empire called Romulus. I remember that because I'm a Trekkie. I remember from my Star Trek days, Romulans, but you begin to appreciate where that came from. And then we had an era when after Christ had died, and we had in the 60s, 80s, 60s, you had Nero, who was then the emperor of Rome. And by that I told you then the Christians were being hunted and were disliked by the Jews as well as the Romans, because the Christians, because they were following Jesus Christ, did not believe in paying homage to men and worshiping Roman idols, etc. So because Rome was seen as this huge nation, this is not political Rome, and they control all these various beliefs and pagan religions, etc. The Christians stood out as not conforming and not in conformity, and so they were persecuted. At one point when Rome was burnt, you have heard the cliche that says, fiddling while Rome burns. That came from the time when Nero was in charge and Rome was destroyed. When he was trying to get out of that, he blamed the Christians for the destruction of Rome. And as a result, they were persecuted even before that, right? And then we had AD 70 when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in that famous siege by Emperor Titus, where all the Jews were killed. This is what was actually predicted in Matthew 24. And Jesus said to them, if you're in the hilltops, keep running. If you're a child, don't come back. If it's pray you don't fight, it's not on the winter or the Sabbath day, because it was going to be such a bad battle that he wanted to make sure that people prosper. Then after that, there was an era now where the church is growing because they are able to use, I talked about that a lot last week, they're able to use the infrastructure of the Roman Empire. Rome was known for its roadways and highways, etc. As a result, the Christians scattered after AD 70, and they were able to spread the gospel in various parts of the kingdom around the Mediterranean. You talk about Paul and his many travels, etc. So as a result, the church was growing, but there was still a lot of persecution taking place, because there would be people who would live in different eras and who would look at the Christians as being heretics and the ones they should destroy. All right. We then had a period where I can talk about Constantine. Constantine had a vision of a cross before he went to battle, and therefore he felt the Christians would have allowed him to win, and as a result, he himself became a Christian, and he said Christianity should now be the religion of the nation. And you think that is a good thing? It was a good thing to some extent, but what it then did is that it allowed him to practice what we refer to later as syncretism. He was able to incorporate beliefs from the other pagan religions around him, so that they could all find an umbrella of safety under Christianity. And I told you that one of the things he did, which we all know, was that he, up to this time, most of the people were still observing the 7-day Sabbath, which was Saturday. But because a lot of the nations who they had conquered worship the sun god on Sunday, he then felt it was okay to designate, now for them to feel comfortable under the Christian religion, he officially designated Sunday as a day of worship, as opposed to Saturday, and that change was significant. It allowed for huge influx into the church, and so the Christian leaders at the time didn't mind if that was a change, because they allowed the church to grow and they had greater power. But what it did, it was that it changed what was effectively a commandment from God in the fourth commandment, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, and a new day of worship was now superimposed onto the Christian world going forward. Obviously, people were not in line with this, and those who were not in line, they were persecuted, and they were burned to the stake. And we talk about Polycarp and others who died at the stake, right? 476, that's the year we talked about, and the barbarians invade most of Western Rome and they conquer it. But now a different kind of Roman leadership emerges with the blessing of the Eastern Empire. Justinian grants civil power to the Bishop of Rome. So now you find that in AD 538, the Bishop of Rome is seen as a political power, not just a spiritual power. And that is important. So he gets not just the head of the church, but the head of the nation in the West. And he continues to rule in concert with his Eastern empires, right? So I wanted to just remind you that during this period, Eastern Rome continues to grow. They go through some battles with the Muslims and stuff, and there are many crusades, etc., in which the Western Rome is trying to help fight as well. And then in 1517, we had Luther, who becomes the head of the Protestant movement. And in 1798, as the French Revolution took its full precedence and became powerful, the French part of their rebellion, if you will, was against monarchies and against any theocracy. They didn't believe in God anymore. This was the age of enlightenment. This was an era of atheism. This was an era of enlightenment. They believe in everything good and everything is great. They didn't believe in any legislature that controlled them. They believed in republicanism, and nobody had any labor rights based on their hereditary lines, but everybody was equal. And so they would have overthrown and killed a lot of the bureaucrats in France with the guillotine, etc. They also captured the Pope at the time, which was the head of the church. And as a result of that, they brought an end to what was the Roman Empire that evolved through the church. If you see 1798 as a key milestone, then you begin to appreciate that the Roman Empire really ran for quite a long time compared to the others, right? Which is what makes it so special. One of the things I wanted to remind you, though, is that this era here, from 538, when the Bishop of Rome kind of became political power, to when eventually the church was decimated, if you will, by the French Revolution, including the capture of its leader. During this period, some key things happened. The official church, I make the distinction here, persecuted the true church. All right, so I wanted to appreciate that. Some people asked me about this last week after this lesson. I didn't emphasize it then, I want to emphasize it now, and we'll do it again next week. The official church, which would have been the Christian church led by the Bishop of Rome, anybody who was against some of the beliefs that crept into the church through syncretism and trying to appease some of the heathen nations, they were persecuted, thrown to the stake, burned to the stake, sent to lions, put to death, sawn to death, etc. So in a way, there was a true church, and I say that deliberately because in a way, God preserved his work on the church and allowed it to continue to flourish even during times of persecution. And this is very, very valid because when Luther came to the scene in 1517, you found that there was a fertile ground for Luther to begin his conversations around righteousness by faith, because already there were true believers who were not following the official line of the church and who were doing what they thought was right according to God. So the true believers, they live. So this should have been lived. That is my bad. Too much of quick writing. But they lived in the shadows. They lived among the rocks. They stayed away from the mainstay. They lived in dungeons and wildernesses, etc. And the word of God is preserved during this period. I think that's extremely important, right? So we're going to appreciate that as we go forward. All right. So let me just remind you of two things. When we read Gonzalez in his book, The Story of Christianity, Volume 1, the early church to the dawn of Reformation, he said to us that the early Roman church practiced two things. One was called syncretism, which was an indiscriminate mixing of elements from various religions and bringing it all into one. And the other was emperor worship. And I talked to you about that last week, right? So I talked to you about the fact that paying for indulgences, fire talk, the traveling priest who would go around and people would pay him for their forgiveness rather than come within the church and do their confessions to the priest, etc. All of that was really mixing elements of other religions and bringing it into the banner of Christianity. So Christianity became a synchronized or synthesized religion. So a religion that kind of took a little bit from here, a little bit from there, and brought it all together. Of course, there was still basic truths of the Bible inside the church, but there were a lot of beliefs that would have crept in there from inside of there, right? And then there was a general view in the early Roman era around emperor worship, where the emperors saw themselves as gods and deities and they required worship. So I said that to say that when the Bishop of Rome now becomes a civil leader, I am not surprised if the bishop then begins, in whoever incarnation it was, not to say any one of them, but they all would have also encouraged, and I would then say demanded, emperor worship, because that was consistent with what was expected of civil leaders around that time, right? So this is the atmosphere that Jews and Christians were seen as unbending fanatics who insisted on their sole worship of their one God, and they were seen as something that needed to be removed and taken out, right? So this is again what we talked about last week, that this was worship of the ruling emperors. That's what they kind of wanted all the time. Remember my word, the word of caution we pulled from the book of Acts and suggested that there would be changes to the church. So this was the early days of the Christian church in the book of Acts. And yet still Jesus is warning that in not a long time, you would very well find that there would be an attempt to come up with perverse things that will draw people away from the scriptures. I suggest then that what the Christians faced was a choice. They either would have followed the true Bible and God's Lord Jesus' teachings, and the genuine way, or they had to adopt traditional ways, human rules that were kept in error, counterfeit, and man's way. And we will come back to this a little bit next week when we talk a little bit about. So we've kind of covered a little bit about Rome, and I want to just close off now talking about our friend the little horn, who we talk about in a little bit detail next week. But in preparation for that, I wanted to emphasize a few things. So again, going back to the scripture, Daniel chapter 7 verse 8 says, and there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great and pompous words. So there are 10 horns in the beast, and then a little horn comes up. He destroys 3 horns to come up, but he's inside of the beast. And that is why I give you a title today that says 4 kingdoms, including the little horn. Because if you begin to realize that Rome lasts as long as it did, then you begin to realize that this little horn most likely represents a period when Rome as a civil power was not so much prominent, but as a religious civil power, they were very prominent. And that is my my guideline, if you will, and my key in interpreting what this could mean. But we'll come to that in a bit as we study it a little bit more, right? What we know is that this horn will be different from the first ones, and he shall subdue 3 kings. So we get some hints about that. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High. And that terminology of Most High in Daniel really could be superimposed to mean God. And it is God, right? And shall seek to persecute the saints of the Most High. Well, we talked a little bit about that a while ago. We talked about the true church versus the official church. And shall intend to change times and laws. We talk about that next week. Then the saints shall be given into his hand. And it says, for a time and times and half a time. This phrase, for a time and time and half a time, is what I like to refer to. Those of you who have studied languages, we talk about an idiomatic expression. An expression that has a meaning specific to people. A bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. And I see that you know what it means, right? And when I tell a man here, go poor luck is not see poor luck. That's an idiomatic expression. If you tell an American that, he doesn't understand what that means, but unless you explain it to him. But if you tell a trainee, go poor luck is not see poor luck, if he was touching you or lashing you, you'll stop soon because you know you're threatening to beat it, right? So this thing of time and times and divide of times is a similar idiomatic expression. And I put it to you, and we'll talk about it next week. And this really means 1 year, 2 years, and half a year. And we'll come back and talk about that next week, right? So just keep that in your mind, and I'll spend some time explaining that a little bit next week. But it's a teaser, so that you can go and do some research, and you want to come back next week and take this class seriously, because there's so much intrigue inside of here, right? So you have this bad beast, and out of it comes a little horn that looks terrible. And he seems to be persecuting and beating up the true church. So again, some points that we could note. It arose from among the 10 horns, which means it comes out of Rome. I don't like that word come out. I like to say it is part of Rome, but Rome in a different form and a different fashion. So it's still Rome, if you will, right? It arose after the 10 horns. So it arose after Rome's breakup, which is interesting because we know that Rome's breakup on the western side occurred in 476 AD. So we are looking for a kingdom, if you will, or a king that will arise after 476 AD. And that is something you just need to remember. And by told you in 538, the Bishop of Rome got political as well as religious power. So that should kind of ring a bell to you. It's different from the 10 horns. So that one is an answer we answering. We're giving you the answer one time because it is not just a political power, but a religious power. It displays 3 kingdoms and its ability to make war. So I'll come back to that. It has the eyes of a man, which means that it has wisdom and intelligence, right? So we'll talk about it. There's another summary that I could give you here that we'll just talk quickly. It says, arose out of the 4th beast, appeared after 10 horns, started small, but rose to be bigger than his fellows. It was put down by 3 kings. It was to put down 3 kings so that the 3 of the first ones were plucked out by the roots. And it had eyes like the eyes of a man. It was a way out. You see, that was the actual wording in Daniel 7:25. That means persecution. All right, it was the thing to change time and laws, and was allotted for a time and 2 times and half a time, which is what the Revised Standard Version gives the translation as. A bit more clearer than the King James Version. All right, are you okay with that? It's a little bit worrying to think that a kingdom will come up that will try to persecute God's people. But look what the chapter ends by saying. It says, judgment shall sit and shall take away his dominion, meaning the dominion of the little horn, to consume and destroy it unto the end. And the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. So Daniel chapter 7 ends on a similar note to Daniel chapter 2. That's why there are such parallel chapters. Even though it covers Daniel chapter 2 political situations, and Daniel chapter 7 covers what happens to God's people, they both end with the same sort of resounding notation that at the end of the day, God's people will remain victorious. And I find that phenomenal and important, because always God is in a view that we will come together. We've seen this before. We've seen this before. When they were in the fiery furnace, we are told, and I just want to make that important point, true faith depends on the quality of our relationship with God, and that shall be capital G, and our trust in him. That is faith that doesn't try to adjust God's will to our lives, but subdues ourselves to do God's will. And that's extremely important. You know, some of us, we go to the doctor, and we try to tell the doctor what is wrong with us. So we say, well, I know that really what happened to me here is that I'm eating too much and therefore putting on weight, and that is what caused my headache. The doctor says, I wanted to do an MRI. You say, we're doing that for? Because I don't tell them what caused it. But he does the MRI, you found there were tumor in your head. But the fact is, now that he tells you you have a tumor in your head, you don't have to adjust your lifestyle to suit what the doctor told you, as opposed to trying to get the doctor to suit what you want to tell him. When we serve God, we need to serve God in spirit and in truth and follow what he says, and not how we see it. Remember Cain and Abel? Cain bought what he thought God wanted, but God only accepted what he asked for, not what you think you should give him, right? So that is extremely important. Faith involves doing the right thing, no matter the consequences. We show real faith and we pray to the Lord for what we want, but trust him to do what is best for us, even when we don't understand. That, brethren, brings us to the end. I know I've moved at a real pace and I covered a lot of stuff, but I'm open for any questions that you may have at this point in time, and we can kind of take that as we close off today. Any questions, anybody? Anybody? Seriously? Starting to get worried now, you know. It's either we're really good or you're all confused. But just know that we will continue reviewing this a little bit next week. For now, just remember that the 4 beasts are aligned to the 4 metals in Daniel chapter 2. And then when we get to the little horn, which we'll spend some time on next week, we will want to line that up with the history of the Roman kingdom after it metamorphosed into a religious political kingdom, and then even dropped off the political kingdom, became more religious kingdom. Any questions, anybody? Anybody? Okay. Oh, I see one question. That's one I thought. Oh, someone said it was well explained, so they don't have any questions. Thank you for that. Let's see if everybody's of the same mind. I know it's a lot, but remember, what happened? So, I know it's a lot, but remember it's on YouTube. So I would encourage you to take some time and just go over the lesson again during the week. Next week I have been repeating and revising from the beginning of Daniel, but next week I won't. I will just start from the beginning of Daniel chapter 7 so that we can pick up where we are and move quickly into what next we need to do. All right? All right, so somebody said not confused, just a lot to take in. And somebody's asking about the 1260 years. I want to hold that question because that is next week's topic. For now, I just wanted to get the flow of the kingdoms as they went from Babylon to Rome, similar to what was in Daniel chapter 2. Next week, when we answer that idiomatic expression, times, 2 times, and half a times, we will talk about 1260 years then. I don't want to prematurely get into that. Just allow this to soak in because we have a lot more to cover as we go forward. All right. So the name of the game is, I know a lot of you have foreknowledge, you know other things, you've studied this before, and you want to try to make it all into one. Let's say the best way to eat an elephant is bit by bit. So we're doing the bit by bit piece with this. I'm trying to get us to the point where we feel comfortable. Any other questions, anybody? Comments? Thank you for your responses, those of you who gave us feedback. I saw another one here. All right, so somebody gives me a really deep one. It says, although the St. Bartholomew massacre was directly committed by France, the Roman Church instigated it. Are we looking at this when we discuss the kings of the north and the south? And yes, we will get to some of those specific battles when we get later on into Daniel, sorry. But for now, I just want to make sure that we grasp the big picture here, which is that God repeats the flow of kingdoms, but when he gets to Rome, he deliberately, and I want us to understand that this is a vision that God gave. So he deliberately characterizes and represents Rome in a very ferocious way, which tells me that God is upset with some of the things Rome did. And that is extremely important. Eh? I mean, granted, God tried with Nebuchadnezzar and stuff and tried to save him. But when he gets to Rome, it seems as if God has given Daniel a vision. And think about Daniel. Daniel is living way before that. So he is thinking, when do I get to go back to Jerusalem? And then he sees a thing where people are being trampled and destroyed. That Daniel would have, at his old age, that was hard for him to deal with and understand. So much so that towards the end, which is, you only get to this king of the north and king of the south. So much so when you get towards the end, Daniel is so distraught by what he sees that the angel says to him, shut up the book, close it up, because you can't understand this thing, and leave it for when Fitzroy and doing Bible class down in 2020, because their knowledge will increase and we'll have a lot more to do, and we can understand what is going on, right? So I want us to appreciate that this is our time. This is our time to understand the scriptures, because we have so much access to knowledge. The internet is so fascinating that you can just search, even if it's Wikipedia, which has sometimes erroneous stuff. But you can just search freely and recognize that there's a sequence to what is presented here and it's coinciding with that. So we'll come to King of the North and King of the South. Particularly, we touch Daniel 10 to 12. In particular, chapter 12, there is a very key representation of the King of the North and the King of the South. But I want to leave that until then. Anything else? Great. Then let's bow our heads to prayer as we close off today's session. And once we do that, like I say, take your time, read through the chapter again, go over the video, and try to see if everything makes sense. Go over last week's as well, when we talked about the history of the church, so that you have a good sense of what is taking place for the Rome. All right? Heavenly Father, we thank you, Lord, for your blessings. We thank you for your word that you have given to us so far way back in the days of Daniel that is now applicable to our time today. That alone is phenomenal. It's so representative of the fact that you are a great God who is willing to reach each and every one of us and warn us and prepare us for the damage and the trials we may experience in the life today. But you have given us the assurance that ultimately you will establish your kingdom. And so, Lord, we are not perturbed, we are not put off by the difficulties of this life. We are hurt and we are sad by the killing and by the evil that surrounds us. But we are sure that despite all of this, one day you will establish an everlasting kingdom. We pray that we would remain faithful to you. And like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego through the fiery furnace, we will adjust our faith to be in line with God and allow you to lead us through periods of trials and disaster and carry us into everlasting life. Be with us through the week as we study and as we continue to pay attention. And then next week, we will continue to review your word and be drawn closer as our prayer in Jesus' most holy name. Amen.